Hello, this is Hiram McEnoch.
And this is Deacon Joseph Swaden. And this is the Orthodox Apologetics Live. First show we've had in a while, Father. This is Deacon Joseph. Hold on. I know what the... Okay, fixed it. Sorry about that.
Okay. Well, we still haven't figured out the Daily Motion stuff, so we're back to using YouTube, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're here on YouTube again, just for a little while. So hopefully within the next couple of days. I can mention that I had to involuntarily change my computer, so I actually had to reinstall everything, even up until the very last few minutes. So that's part of the reason why there were delays. It's all my fault. Sorry, I apologize to everyone listening. Anyway, so yeah, we haven't done a show in a while, Father.
Yeah. What are we going to talk about?
Well, we can look at some of the questions that are going in the group, and I think we can go from there. See what discuss some of the other things that have been popping up in the news and so on and so forth. Let me see here. Forgive me, I'm completely scattered. So my stuff is here and there and all over the place. So give me just 1 second while I'm trying to put this together. Okay. And I'll just mute this here. Let's see here. Okay, so we didn't do any shows during the Nativity Week. I did a quick mention on that. But past that, it's been otherwise, it's been pretty peaceful. How was your Nativity Week, Father?
Everything was good.
All right. Thank God for that. Let's see. I guess one of the things that's important to talk about, of course, is basically being in the right frame of mind when dealing with apologetics. And what I mean by that is, what's the purpose? Well, I hate to stress, the purpose of the thing, but it actually came up in a few different ways on the different fora, and that is that defending the faith, it's important to present a clear and concise argument, but we don't control the ending. And what I mean by that is, it can be viewed as sometimes argument can be viewed in terms of a win-lose scenario, but you never know what's really happening underneath the surface. So I want to make sure that people understand. Hello, Jonathan. That people understand. This isn't debate class. It's about, granted, there's some good to formal debate, structure. I'm not attacking that, but what I'm saying is, it's not like my side versus your side, and whoever wins is the true church. That's not what happens. Because the truth is the truth, no matter the quality of the argument, etc. Although that's something that can definitely be addressed. I mean, how do you feel, Father?
About what?
About what I just asked. In terms of apologetics versus, that it's not strictly argument, that there's a purpose to it, no longer purpose, greater purpose.
Apologetics is arguing for the truth, I think. Right?
No, I'd agree with. Yeah, it's arguing for the truth, but you can't make it into gotcha moments and so on and so forth. It's not about just winning. It's about winning souls, not just winning arguments. If that makes sense.
Okay.
I don't know. Are you following or?
No, I'm following. I'm just I don't really have much to add to that. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. No, that's fair. So we've got a couple of people in the chat. We see you, and hello. And if you have any questions, throw them out there. If you're wondering why I haven't pulled up any questions from the Facebook forum, it's quite frankly because on this computer that I've just set up, I don't even have my Facebook password. So I have to put that in, and then I will get questions. So it may be a couple of minutes while I'm doing that.
Okay.
Let me see here. Okay, I've opened up a bunch of things that I didn't want to open. Do you have Facebook open, Father?
Yeah, someone asked the question, does anybody know of a time a Roman Pope has been reprimanded in a council?
That was
In
an
a
interesting
council,
question. There were a few different answers.
in the Fifth Ecumenical Council,
Yeah, the
Vigilius
Pope and
was...
Vigilius. And
well, Honorius was dead. I mean, they're talking about a pope was reprimanded in a council. A living pope is the implication.
yeah, but living popes almost never showed up to the council. So,
yeah, except for Pope Vigilius. But he was kidnapped.
Lucky him.
He was arrested by the emperor and forcibly brought to the council, so he didn't have much of a choice.
But that's it's an interesting question. I think we start getting into I think it becomes a little bit of like what's the word? It's a little bit of splitting hairs once you're like, but was he condemned at the council? Was he condemned in his life? The whole point is the root of all these arguments is that a pope cannot be tried by a council. We know that's not true. We know they can. We know they've been anathematized. We know all this stuff. So it starts becoming like, but was he there?
Well, another example would be that Pope John XII in 962 or 963 was actually tried by a council in Rome.
That's not the cadaver synod, is it?
No, the cadaver synod is when they dug up Pope Formosa's body and put it on trial. I mean, I guess that's another case of
yeah, but that actually was considered illegal, and then they condemned. Well, Hildebrand brought it back.
He actually was dead when they put him on trial. I mean, literally, it wasn't just. That's a little bit different.
Say something.
Exactly. And they put him in his vestments and everything, and there's a famous painting of that,
Yeah, but what's funny is that then Hildebrand brought back the whole cadaver synod thing after it had been condemned. I guess like he read the history books and thought, well, this is glorious history. I must bring this back. And so that's what he did to, Pope Clement III.
The famous painting has people like accusing Pope Formosa's body, pointing fingers at it. It's like a skeleton. Basically.
And he's just,
it's absolutely ridiculous. It was a really low point. But in 962 or 963, I can't remember right now, what happened was that Pope John XII was considered so terrible that the Emperor Otto I, I believe, came into Italy with his army and with a large number of German bishops. And then he came with the Lombard bishops, were basically have been the bishops of northern Italy. So, and then with some Roman bishops, they held a council to examine the charges against John XII, and they summoned John XII to the council, and John XII was like, I'm not coming to the council, and if anybody who tries to say anything against me, I'm going to excommunicate them. They didn't listen, and they tried him anyway, and they declared him deposed. And and then they elected Benedict VIII in his place, and John XII died too. I don't know, 3 days later. He was ended up a husband found him in bed with his wife, and they got in a fight and he died.
Yeah, he was killed. Yeah,
he was killed. Either he died at the fight or he died from injuries the next day. Histories are kind of conflicting on it. But that's an example. And as far as I understand, the Vatican technically still counts Leo VIII as his successor. Now they try to say that something like a Benedict V it was like the real successor, but he retired, and therefore when he retired, Leo VIII automatically became pope. But that doesn't really fit into the Roman Catholic system, where you have to have the cardinals elect somebody. It's right. Not a system of, well, we got two counter popes, and one's the true pope, but he willingly resigns under pressure, and then the other guy who we said was uncanonical automatically becomes canonical. That's never one. So that's the case of John XII being tried. So Pope Vigilius was tried. That was back in 553, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, I believe.
Yep.
And Pope Honorius was already dead, but he was still anathematized posthumously. Now I think Pope Pelagius II, who was Pope, I guess, around 559 or the late 550s after Vigilius. When he became Pope, that is Pelagius II, there was so much antagonism to him that the Roman churches and monasteries would not commemorate him because they believed, I guess, he was a murderer and thus ineligible to be pope. And so they simply would not commemorate him. And so what had to happen was they had to have this big kind of attempt to defend. He had to defend himself, saying, "Look, I didn't murder Pope Vigilius, or I think that's the previous pope." And General Narses, who was the Byzantine military commander, kind of came into the city, and they have this big ceremony where Pelagius II had to affirm and swear on the gospel books, basically, that he had not murdered the previous pope. He had done none of these terrible things, and then they accepted him. But I mean, he kind of had that. They kind of had to have a meeting of the Roman clergy and people, which is effectively a council, and he had to defend himself to them. All right, so I mean that's another example of that transpiring.
Okay.
And,
the point is, it's not. It's.
I mean, it didn't happen. It didn't happen all the time, but it did happen, and it did happen. It was not unknown that something like that could happen. So.
Okay, let me see. We got a question, and that was, how would you make sense of the formula of Pope Hormisdas seems to support papal supremacy? It's Saint Hormisdas. It doesn't support papal supremacy in the sense that you would think it does. My suggestion would be, if you are on the war zone, just search Hormisdas, and you'll find that there's actually a number of discussions about the, not just Hormisdas, the Libellus, but also other things regarding that. We've talked about.
And remember how there's like there's some interpolated version of it.
There's an interpolated version. There's two different versions of the Libellus,
and there's one that they put the Filioque in, and it's not the original one.
And that wasn't even the original one. The one that they quote from is the one that was torn up by by other bishops. They rejected it outright, so they created a softer one. So no, I don't think that that's it's a very good argument. It certainly doesn't support papal supremacy in the post 11th century sense. Again, and I love stressing this, I cannot stress this enough, please look up Dictatus Papae, because that is where the concepts of papal supremacy come from, and they don't exist previously to that in any real defined form. So you have to keep in mind that whenever people are quoting the fathers from before the 11th century on that, they are reading meaning into it that wasn't there. So that's that's what I have to say.
I think another point to make about the reunion that happened in 519 between. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, there's this background noise, like a fan or something.
Yeah, it's trying to fix the mic still.
Yeah, the other point interesting to make was that when Constantinople wanted to go back into communion with Rome in 519. Technically, from the perspective of Rome, Constantinople had basically been in schism and heresy by the Akakian schism. All right, so it kind of would make sense that they would make all kinds of demands, But notice that even when they made demands, they ultimately had to negotiate nevertheless. So it wasn't like Hormisdas is like, you're going to do this, and no, that's it. So anyway, what other issues?
Well, we're getting more questions now.
Where are these questions arriving at?
In YouTube.
I see. Okay.
And so Gregory Timoturgus asks, can you talk about some Western fathers and their particular impact on the church? Wow. That's big. That's a big question. I mean, if you're talking about specific fathers in terms, when you say impact on the church, Gregory, if you could be a little bit more specific, are you talking about things like doctrinal things like the Tome of St. Leo? Or are you talking about like the influence of St. Gregory the Great on the Byzantine liturgy? I mean, there was so much interplay between Eastern and Western fathers in the undivided church that it's a very difficult question to answer unless you're more specific.
Oh, that's interesting. Should we really be saying undivided church? The church can't be divided, really.
Let me rephrase that. Yeah, you're right. That's
I know, but people say that all the time.
They do, and it's a mistake because you're right. With the Hildebrandian thing, it really is a horrible mistake. And I fall into errors as well.
No, I'm saying is that I've seen this a lot in text about the undivided. People talk about the undivided church.
Right, but that implies the church was divided.
Yeah, it applies the branch theory that there's the Roman Catholic, which are the one branch, and the Eastern Church, which is the other branch. But that's not, what should be, I guess you can say undivided Christendom, essentially. That's almost what people kind of mean when they say that.
But it's just better to say the first millennium church. The church of the first millennium is much easier to say as well. So I would just go with that. Well, okay, now Gregory said dogmatics. All right, well, if you're looking at the dogmatic aspect, Western Fathers were involved in almost every ecumenical council and had a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of input in the dogmatic definitions that would be clarified over the centuries.
There's Pope St. Leo's letter to Flavian. And to the emperors, which I think is that's the Tome of Leo actually is either. I think the Tome of St. Leo is either his letter to Flavian or the letter to the empress. And that was received by Chalcedon, and it was examined and declared to be Orthodox.
Well, I say
there's the letter of Pope St. Agatho to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which proclaiming orthodoxy. There's the Lateran Synod of 649, which anathematized the Monothelite heresy and the Monoenergist heresy. There's a 729, I think, and 731 synods of Rome, which held under Pope St. Gregory II and III, which anathematized iconoclasm. There's St. Augustine's work against the Donatist heretics.
I was actually
and the Manichaean heretics.
Yeah, I was going to say St. Augustine's work in general.
Yes, there is the work of St. John Cassian against Nestorius and against Pelagius.
There's the commonatory of St. Vincent of Lerins, which helps us
against all heresies
and helps us clarify tradition in times of difficulty.
There is, for example, there is several, I think, letters and epistles of Pope St. Julian from the 4th century defending St. Athanasius. There's St. Hilary of Poitiers, who wrote his De Trinitate against the Arian heresy, which was influential East and West.
And there's St. Isidore of Seville, who,
converted the Visigoths.
Also compiled the first major encyclopedia that the world had. There's a lot. But on dogmatics, a lot of it.
St. Ambrose of Milan was a combat of the Arians. St. Eusebius of Vercelli, combat of the Arians. St. Maximus of Turin, combat of the Arians. That's the least probably we've probably named at least 9 fathers already.
9 fathers, and we're just scratching this. That's just off the top of our heads.
Yes.
There's a lot. There's a lot, and so if you feel called to study the Western Fathers, do it, because you can learn a lot about the church. It's a good thing to do.
How would I explain? One person asks the Trinity to a Muslim or a Jew. What's my question is? What are their objections to the Trinity? If their objections are that somehow it teaches that there are 3 gods, I'd ask how, because the Trinity teaches that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all have the same essence. They all have the same divine essence, the same divine will. That the Son was eternally begotten from the Father, and the Holy Spirit eternally proceeds from the Father. And there is no division in the Godhead. So, I would ask how that violates the principle that there is one God. By one God, they seem to be positing a Unitarian argument of one person or one hypostasis.
Yeah, pretty much.
That seems to be their argument. However, if you ask a Muslim or Jew, ask them, is the wisdom of God, has it always been with him? All right? Or did God create his own wisdom? All right? anybody who's Jewish, if they're Jewish in a meaningful religious sense and believe in the Old Testament, they're going to say God's wisdom was always with them. All right, and was God's word always with them?
Exactly,
and,
the concept of the Logos.
Exactly, the word of the Lord. And even in the older pre-first century times, you do in fact have Jewish texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, which talk about the Memra of the Lord. And the Memra was, I think, the Syriac, Aramaic word for the word, their equivalent of the Logos. All right, and they explained the Memra of the Lord in such a way that he acts. It's the angel of the Lord, the word of the Lord that spoke to Moses. So, I think it's really I'm trying to figure the words out. I mean, if you read through some parts of the Quran, it's been many, many years. It seems evident that Muhammad didn't really understand the Trinity, or he intentionally misinterpreted it, or it was never explained to him, because he was saying things like, I don't know, that the Christians believed Mary was one of the members of the Trinity.
Yeah, the Quran says there's one God, not three, not four, and that's just insanity, because we don't believe in three gods or four gods. But the point is that one of the problems that you're going to run into, at least this is just the way I see it, is that when you're arguing with somebody who takes such a Unitarian position, and Muslims and Jews do take a primarily Unitarian position, you run the risk of reducing aspects of God to attributes. And so the thing is, you have to remember personhood and their roles, but remembering the unity of the essence at the same time. Now, I'm not saying this because you couldn't explain it in terms of attributes. You can, and many people do, and they're called Sabellians. But the point is, if you want to explain it properly, you have to always point out that this is a mystery. So, some of the things that they're asking for with concrete explanations are going to be difficult. You can reference, for example, the Memra. You can reference, the Logos. But again, if a person is deliberately being obtuse, like they start to say the Logos is a creation or something like that, then you're just going to run into problems, only because you may end up misspeaking in terms of how to present it properly, because, again, it's kind of a primitivistic view of God that Islam reverted to in some schools of Judaism. And I think that in the more mystical traditions of Judaism, that's not, it wouldn't pass muster. But
some of these so-called mystical traditions of Judaism, the Kabbalist stuff, they go into insane things, like saying there's like 92 Sephiroth, or like
right.
manifestations. I mean, it becomes almost Hinduistic. Actually, it's worse than it's worse than anything.
It's worse than anything we could come up with.
And we're not coming up with anything.
Yeah.
Okay. Assaulter Rifle says, I have recently heard new calendarists say that if our ecclesiology was true, then the Russian church would have been anathematized, since they didn't accept the Hesychast councils for a while, and they would have been anathema. So what are your thoughts on this? Well, is it true they didn't accept the Hesychast councils? I have seen no evidence of that. One, the Russian church, the metropolitan of the Kiev, who during the 650s through the 1380s, was a metropolitan of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which held these councils. All right. So, how is it, was the Ecumenical when they were confirming and appointing metropolitans in Kiev, were they appointing people that
were against the Hesychast?
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. The Russian church was an autonomous, I don't even know if they were actually autonomous. They were a metropolitan church of the Ecumenical Patriarchate when those councils were held. So, what evidence is there that they did not accept the Hesychast councils? This is something that, like, some of the name worshippers come up with a lot of times. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying Assaulter Rifle is a name worshiper, but a lot of them every day will come up with this, and they'll say that, well, the Russian church didn't accept it because in 1912 and in 1913 they condemned name worship, and they're implying that name worship in Maslavy is the same as hesychasm, which is false, equating. And some of that, unfortunately, is done because you have prominent Greek New Calendar Church bishops like Metropolitan Horotheos Vlachos or Nephkos, and he teaches name worship. He teaches the name of God is the same as the energy of God. He actually explicitly teaches that. And so a lot of them kind of go in for that, and you have a lot of these name worshippers that write texts saying that Anthony Bolotovich was rediscovering the works of the ancient fathers. And I think they say that because in the Russian Council of like 1913, there's a statement where the Russian bishops state that St. Gregory Palamas never once said the energy of God is God. He said the energy is uncreated, but he never called it God. And I've actually heard some people say that that's actually true, that there's no place where St. Gregory Palamas explicitly says the energy is God. Now, I can't quite remember if somebody can pull up the works of St. Gregory Palamas real quick. I have to go read them again and tell me, does St. Gregory explicitly use the word the energy is God as opposed to the energy is uncreated? Now, this might be one of those kind of arguments of reduction where, well, obviously, if the energy is uncreated, it has to be God, and that would make sense. But not to get into that whole whole discussion again, but I see no evidence that the Russian Church anathematized or refused to accept the Hesychast councils. What evidence is there that they refused to accept the Hesychast councils? And usually,
I think that's really the harder question. Because if you look in the Russian monastic tradition, whether you look at Sergius of Radonezh or you look at, other saints like that in that period, many of them copied their traditions from Mount Athos, where this spirituality was already well known. So I don't find a really great argument for it. Maybe at best you can talk about the Westernizing period under Peter the Great. I can't imagine where there would be such evidence of this, but a lot of things went wrong under Peter the Great. We'd have to see what you're talking about, because you can't just automatically assume that that's correct, because it doesn't sound correct, and so we'd have to see proof of it.
Oh, by the way, just so people don't mistake me, I'm not. I do believe the uncreated energies are uncreated, are divine, and are God. I'm just saying that some of the Russian bishops were saying St. Gregory Palamas never uses those words. Uncreated energy is God. So I know I didn't. There are some people who say there's one or two sermons in which he does use those specific terms, but those hadn't been translated into Slavonic or something like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the Russian Church rejected the teaching on the uncreated energies.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see. Assault rifles, particularly on page 9. No idea.
Page 9 of what?
I don't know. Let's see. And would Romanidians' versions of ancestral sin instead of original sin be a type of Neo-Pelagianism? Well,
hold on. Hold on. Let me see. Yes. In fact, many of the Romanian views, they basically view death as basically equivalent to original sin, physical death, and because we die, we have a fear of death, and fear of death impels us to commit sins. It's just mortality. That's in fact a condemned view. That's condemned by the Council of Carthage in the canons 120 through 127. In fact, Hierotheos Vlachos, again, I hate to bring him up because he's a prominent Romanidian right now, teaches forms of Neo-Pelagianism. So, this is why I would not trust any of those people. Okay.
Well, let's see.
Mickey Mouse says the Quran is complete nonsense. That's true.
We agree. Yep. And could a substitutionary view of the cross be combined with the Christus Victor model of the cross instead of modern theologians hating any type of substitutionary view of redemption?
I think all the views of the of atonement are the Christus Victor, the substitution. All those are accurate. I don't think it's an either or situation. I don't, so. He says they did reject the councils for a period. Okay,
we need the proof.
Yeah, show me the proof.
I thought the church in the Balkans rejected hesychasm.
Says who? Who? Someone
where
says.
Where are all these people coming from?
Where are they?
Not you guys, but where are all these people telling you this stuff coming from? They're like, oh, well, the church rejected this there. Oh, okay. Prove it.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Show me the evidence where the Russian church and the Balkan church are like, we condemn hesychasm and we condemn uncreated energy.
We condemn Gregory Palamas, and we affirm Barlow.
That's why we have him on. That's why we celebrate him in the Sunday and Lent. Exactly. Exactly. Am I correct? Okay, I read it from A History of Russian Philosophy. Okay, so what's the source material they bring up?
Okay.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just saying a lot of times people say in books the Russian church didn't accept this, or the so and so didn't believe this. It's the same stuff about Pope Damasus in the 390s taught the Filioque, which is totally bogus. Or Gennadius in Marseille in the 490s taught the Filioque, which is totally bogus. All right, so they have to give you some sort of primary source material. I posted the link above. This is what I meant. You're gonna have to post it in game because I'm not seeing a link.
Okay, I posted the link above. That's what. Let me take a look and see if I can see it. I don't see a link. Post the link again.
Tell me the name of the book.
Yeah. And let's see. Would be interesting to hear you both in a debate with someone. I can say with certainty it's not that interesting, at least on my end. Maybe with Father Enoch, I don't know, but I don't think I'm that.
I don't really think it's all that's cracked up to be.
Yeah, it's usually I found, at least for me personally, I found that the experience can be disappointing. It can be it's good, and I think it's good, for the salvation of the person you're talking to. But what are you going to do?
I mean, they want us to be some sort of great champions and to get do all the gotcha stuff.
The whole point is we want you to all be great champions, and we want to help people grow. Okay, I'm getting a call from the Abbey. Can you hold on just 1 second? Well, if you can continue, Father, for just a sec.
Yeah. Okay. You got to mute yourself, Father. Okay, another point I brought up would be about the whole Monophysitism, and it should be interesting to point out that all the original leaders of the Monophysites were Greeks, or Greek speakers. Dioscorus, Peter Fuller, or Timothy the Cat, then Severus, and Jacob Aridaeus was. I don't think he was technically Greek, but he spoke Greek. So that's another point. And therefore the reason I bring that up is that it means Monophysitism is not a linguistic difference from Orthodoxy. It's actually a heresy. So, all right, we're just simply going to wait for Father Joseph since I am terrible at speaking on my own. And by the way, I'm trying to find any reference about the Russian church or the Balkan church condemning St. Gregory Palamas. Hold on. Let's see. The reason I say that is because I'm Western Rite Orthodox, but it's my understanding that in the Byzantine Church, the second Sunday of Great Lent is commemorate St. Gregory Palamas, and yes, this is true. So it would be very strange that the Russian Church and the Balkan Church would condemn or reject the teachings of St. Gregory Palamas, but yet continuously have the second Sunday of Great Lent honoring him. So, that's kind of interesting. Just due to the fact that they have that the Russians, and the Slavic Balkan churches celebrate St. Gregory back in the 8th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, honored St. Gregory Palamas with a Sunday, the second Sunday in Great Lent, and sang his praises and extolled his teachings. For example, they read from the Synodicon of Orthodoxy. And I believe the Great Synodicon, doesn't the Great Synodicon also condemn, let me look at the Great Synodicon, doesn't it also condemn, doesn't it condemn the heresy of Barlaam, I think, too?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does.
And then there's the Synodicon of the Holy Spirit, which is read on Pentecost Monday, and I think that also condemns Barlaam, the opponents of St. Gregory. So, my question is, how could one argue the Russian church and the Balkan Slavic churches? My My understanding. So God save the
Yeah,
czars.
there's chapters against Barlaam and Akindus in the Synodicon.
Okay, so before I go to Assault Rifle's second question, God Save the Tsar says, my understanding is they rejected the council for a short period of time, later accepting them. That would make sense to them later celebrating St. Gregory. Again, I don't know if that's true either. I think I have read that the other Eastern patriarchs did not quite understand what was being taught. One of remember, there are 3 Palamite councils, by the way. All right. And they're supposedly the Patriarch of Antioch misunderstood one of them because there was propaganda, but then they later accepted them. I mean, for example, any church that accepts St. Gregory Palamas as a saint and has a Sunday dedicated to him, then they accept St. Gregory Palamas' teaching. Even if you want to argue,
not counting the Uniates, though.
Well, I know. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure that that's not something that's much later. Because I would actually be interested in seeing Uniate books from the 17th century honoring Gregory Palamas. I somehow doubt that's actually what happened.
No. What it was they had something called the Eastern Catholic Sanctoral. Basically, the Pope after the unions of Brest and Uzerod, he basically issued a decree that they could just leave the calendars looking the same.
Yeah, I still want to see the reason I'd want to see. I'm not defending the Vatican, but the Vatican used to be pretty strict about those things. For example, that's why it didn't allow the Chaldean and Malabar unions to use the 2 extra anaphors they had until like the early 20th century in order to combat supposed Orthodox incursions. Now you're right; they might have allowed it, but it wouldn't make much sense. Why would the Vatican have allowed commemoration of Gregory Palamas when he anathematized the Vatican?
The Vatican allows St. Mark of Ephesus in some of their calendars.
Yeah, but that's, again, I'm wondering if that's a more modern thing. Anyway, if somebody could send me a link to a Uniate book to prove that. But my point, not to get involved in that whole other question, but I think what people try to say is the Russian church may have accepted, and the Balkan churches may have accepted the commemoration of St. Gregory Palamas and sang all the hymnology on the second Sunday of Great Lent, but they didn't really understand it. Well, to be honest, who really understands the mystery of the uncreated energies? All right. I mean, for example, there can be many people who devout Orthodox that can read the writings of St. Gregory Palamas, and they can still be blown away and not really understand everything. You can understand the general teaching, all right? But to try to say, did every single Russian peasant truly understand all the aspects that was being taught? Probably not. But did they assent to what the church was teaching? Do they say, I may not understand, but it's like St. Augustine. He says he believes in order that he might understand. All right? You have faith that that's what the church teaches, and you believe it. Okay. Salter Rifle up there asks, is St. Isaac the Syrian actually a Chalcedonian believer, or was he an historian whose writings are acceptable?
Okay, well, I found something that might be, before you get to that might be relevant.
Okay.
And it's, I'm reading this Palamism. I guess it's from Martin Jugi's The Palamite Controversy. I guess this is the source that they're referring to. And what it says actually is...
Can you link it to me?
Yeah, I can link it to you directly here. Hold on. And so if you... hold on just one sec. It's not quite as far-reaching. It talks about the condemnation by Patriarch Ignatius in 1344, but it was already victorious by the end of that century. Then it says, Nicephorus Gregoris informs us that the Metropolitan of Kiev at first vigorously rejected the Palamite tomes which the Patriarch Callistus had sent him, and in his reply refused their doctrine. Similar acts of resistance were seen in the metropolitan sees that were under the authority of the Latins, and in certain autonomous ecclesiastical regions like the Church of Cyprus, but little by little they diminished and in the end disappeared completely. And it seems cases of return from the Barlaamite heresy to Palamite orthodoxy are fairly common in the second half of the 14th century. And then it includes some citations from the closest.
Did you send me a link somewhere, Father?
I did, in the Hangout.
Oh, Bekos WordPress? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's the uni of WordPress.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, he's quoting the book from Martin Jugi. I'm assuming Martin Jugi.
See, I would want to see the reply of
itself.
The Metropolitan of Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Because was it like he condemned it? I mean, or was it something like he was saying, this sounds, can you please explain this? I can't accept it until it's explained more. You know what I mean?
It certainly doesn't look, but even this does not look like it was a repudiation of Palinism for centuries. It looks like it was during that particular century some people questioned it and eventually accepted it.
Okay,
so
before the end of the 14th century, basically, it says.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically where it ends. And then there's no debate. So that's it was a short. I would say that some may have been suspicious about the councils or suspicious about the ecumenical patriarchs' uses this.
The problem is that this has often happened in church. For example, the Fifth Ecumenical Council was not accepted by some parts of the church until like 700. That didn't mean they broke communion with the church. They just misunderstood things that we're teaching.
Right.
All right.
And then eventually it cleared itself up.
Exactly. It was all cleared up.
So, well, if you consider, Palinism versus iconoclasm, I would say it was much more quickly.
Yeah, and they give, and then this link here, it gives you can read the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, and you can read the anathemas against those who deny that the uncreated light of Tabor is uncreated. So, yep, okay. Let's go on to about Saint. I think we may have answered Saint Isaac. Saint Isaac the Syrian had to be Orthodox. I hate to use this kind of following reason because the Orthodox Church venerates him. Therefore, he had to be part of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah,
I know it's kind of making a so-called sacrifice of the intellect, but I think there's more. I think because he's part of the church's calendar, and he's been venerated for at least 1,300 years, that the church knows something that we don't. And I have not done all the studies probably necessary to look into the question, but I just on that fact alone, I believe he lived and he died as a bishop in the Orthodox Church. Okay.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, and what would be a good recommended patristic reading list for a good overall view of church teaching?
Basically, the Church Fathers.
Yeah. In other words, all of them.
That 38 volume set, that comes from the Erdmans. That's reprinted by Hendrickson. You can find it on find it online. Okay.
So there's a lot. There's a lot to read. If you're looking for something basic, you can start with St. John of Damascus on the Orthodox faith. You can start with St. Hilary of Poitiers, the faith of the Easterns. But from there, you've got to literally just start, reading the scriptures, reading what the fathers say in their commentaries. St. Chrysostom, St. Augustine, St. Theophylact.
So Joan Mack asks, wait, what language did the church in Italy use before the Great Schism?
What part of Italy?
You'd have to be more specific. What do you mean? What language about what? What are you talking about? You have to be more specific.
Yeah, well, I'm presuming that's a reference to the church language. I would assume.
Oh, you mean okay. So physical, the literal, the linguistic, they use Latin and Greek.
Yeah, depending on where you live.
Greek was used in southern Italy and in Sicily, and Latin in central and parts of southern Italy and in northern Italy. Those were the so-called liturgical languages used.
Yeah. Hello, Justice. Assault rifle. Was there pre-schism veneration of St. Augustine? Well, considering that he was considered blessed in an ecumenical council, I'd say yes.
Yes.
And Adam Zarnikov's writings anywhere so I can further see what the Latins changed from his writings.
Yeah, they're posted up on the Orthodox Apologetics room. They're not translated into English. You're going to have to read. You're going to have to go through the Latin text.
Yeah. And then let's see here. St. Augustine is unjustly blamed a lot. Yes.
Are you seeing comments that I'm not seeing somewhere?
No. He asked like 3 questions at once, so I'm just going through the same one.
Yeah. See, what oftentimes happens is people will say that because the Byzantine Church did not have a distinct service written for St. Augustine in the 10th century or the 11th century, and therefore he's not a saint. But the problem, it's kind of a ridiculous argument because it's kind of saying that if they're not on the calendar of the great church, then they never were a saint. For example, when was St. Patrick of Ireland put on the calendar of the great church of Constantinople? I don't know. Was he probably the 19th, I don't know, 20th century.
Yeah.
Maybe St. Nicodemus did. I know that technically St. Ambrose kind of had, there was this attempt by one patriarch in the 10th century to make a service for St. Ambrose, but it never kind of really got popular. And it was only, I think, during the 18th century that they kind of revived it. All right. So, I mean, ultimately what's being argued with the people who refuse to venerate St. Augustine and some of the other priests and Western saints is the argument that only the Church of Constantinople have the authority to determine who's a saint or not. And it's kind of like, well, they didn't go into schism, and so they lasted the longest, so therefore they can judge everybody else. Well, their orthodoxy lasted for a time, that's true, but that didn't mean that the Church of Constantinople was competent to deny, St. Finian of Ireland being a saint. They didn't even know about him. So, and the same thing, for example, I could probably name, for example, St. Thornkill or Thrakund, who were martyred by the Vikings back in the 700s. So, they were regarded by the priestism, Western Orthodox of the time, as being saints. Was the church in Gaul and in England and in Ireland in the 500s and 600s competent, being in communion with the church for hundreds of years already, having been sent by, people like St. Gregory the Great, were they competent to judge their own people to be saints or not? Or did they have to wait to the ecumenical patriarchate? This is like, for example, this attempt in like earlier this year, where I guess there was some Moscow Patriarchate or ecumenical patriarchate group that said, we have now added for the first time 300 Spanish saints to the calendar of the church. I was partially kind of upset,
and they were very
outraged,
grateful.
and they were very straightforward. I was like outraged, but I was like, really? So St. Martin of Braga now only is really a saint, and and because they equate Orthodox Church with basically the Church of basically anybody the great Church of Constantinople and its created daughter churches that later became autocephalous churches. All right. So what really should be attitude is that, well, we've now added these already existing saints to our existing calendar. That'd be better, It's more of an issue of us discovering the saints that have been forgotten on earth, although they were never forgotten. They could, ultimately, because they're in heaven. Okay.
I think we're good on questions right now. Assault Rifle comments. I feel like listening to Ancient Faith Radio before I found out about true orthodoxy ruined my idea of orthodoxy, and I have to relearn everything the correct way.
A lot of people have that reaction about Ancient Faith Radio.
Yeah, Ancient Faith Radio just does that. I don't know why. I mean, it's just I can't listen to it. It's not. I mean, I think the thing that drives me nuts is the lady, just reading off the Psalms every 10 minutes.
I don't know how bad. The last time I listened to any of it was 2004.
Yeah, I haven't listened
to 2006 maybe or something like that. I haven't listened to any of it for
going
on 18 years or so.
I think like 8 or 9 years ago I might have heard something. I'll listen to the occasional podcast if somebody says, "Oh, you must hear this." I'll go, "Okay, here we go." But yeah, generally I don't listen to Ancient Faith Radio. I think it's
well, I think he's referring to the whole. For example, this is another major issue, the whole original sin issue. All right, you can read the canons of Carthage 419, canons 120 through 127 to 128, which contain explicit dogmatic pronouncements of the church that have been accepted by the early church, East and West, and are found in the Nomo Canon, or the Pedalion of Saint Photius and other fathers. All right, which you can read the writings of Saint Simeon the New Theologian, who is, I believe, 10th century. He reposed around the year 1000 on the sin of Adam, and Father Seraphim Rose translated and published those works. All right, and you can read numerous other fathers, and what they teach about original sin is not what Ancient Faith Radio is teaching, nor is it what the majority of people in the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Moscow Patriarchate and even Rokor have been teaching for some time now. All right, those people essentially teach some variant of Pelagianism. They teach that death They either teach that death is all that we inherit from Adam, along with corrupted passions because of physical changes in the body. Or they teach that when a baby is baptized, it's not baptized for the remission of sins. But if you read the canons of Carthage, which been given ecumenical status and contain dogmatic pronouncements, all right, if you read that and you read St. Nicodemus's commentary, it says, and when infants are baptized, they are baptized for the remission of sins. That is particularly the sin of Adam. So that sin is cleansed from them, as well as being spiritually regenerated, and being united to the church. All right. So it's not just, baptism's a nice thing to make somebody who's already pure even purer. All right. So anyway, I'm just saying that's one of those major issues that has been obscured by people in the past 100 years. I guarantee a lot of people don't know about it. And if you point out these things in the rudder, they'll say, well, we don't really have to accept it. In fact, I pointed out one of these canons to one former Hockna priest several years ago. And he was like, well, I don't have to accept it because the fathers didn't understand correctly the teaching, So if someone says that, there's not much you can do.
As soon as you hear the fathers didn't understand, it just tune them out, because that means that they really...
They're either a crazy crank, all right, literally they have some kind of mental problem, or they're just a heretic.
Yeah.
And if they're not going to really want to argue, and if they don't want to use the fathers as a source to determine teaching, if it's just themselves, then I hate to say it, it's like after a man who's a heretic after the second and third admonition, just reject. You can't really do much there. Assault the Rifle says, is there a part 2 to the rudder, which includes all canons and councils from after St. Nicodemus' time to our day? Well, first off, we should note that St. Nicodemus, as I recall, Father Joseph, proposed in like 1800. Can you look that up real quick? St. Nicodemus ends the councils in the Pedalion. Now, he didn't invent the Pedalion. There were already editions of it.
Right.
It was the last council mentioned in the Pedalion is, I think, the basically
1809.
Yeah, okay. The last council mentioned in the Pedalion is the 879, the 3 canons from the 879 AD council, which is oftentimes called the 8th Ecumenical Council. I'm going to look that up real quick, but I think that's the last council mentioned. Now, people are correct to say that there were many councils that transpired after that, but
not after St. Nicodemus's time. That the only one that I know about.
By St. Nicodemus's time, there had already been probably dozens of councils between. Remember, I think he's
pan-Orthodox. I think he's referring to the pan-Orthodox councils, and there's basically 3 of them. And then if you count the Palamite councils, I think there's 2 of those. But outside of that, I think the last.
The last council mentioned the Pedalion mentions the first 7 ecumenical councils. Then it mentions the first, second council. It mentioned which was held in 861. Then it mentions the council held in the Temple of the Holy Wisdom, which is oftentimes called the 8th Ecumenical Council, held in 879. Then it's the Council of Carthage, which was like in the 250s. Then it mentions Ancyra, Neo-Caesarea, Gangra, Antioch, Laodicea, and Sardica, which were all in the second regional council of Constantinople, which were all in the 4th century, I believe. Yes.
Yeah.
And then it mentions the Council of Carthage in 419. So, and then you have these canons of the individual fathers that are at the very end of the of distinct fathers.
Yeah, because those were added by Trullo.
Exactly. Some of the councils of the individual fathers actually came after Trullo. For example, I think Patriarch Nicephorus is mentioned. Let me see. I'm looking at. Let's see. For example, Saint Nicephorus the Confessor is after that. Saint Teresius of Constantinople, they're mentioned later. So because oftentimes when the canons of these individual fathers, I probably would say Saint Photius and then a little bit of the later writers kind of collated individual fathers they thought were important and put. I mean, for example, there are a lot of canons of other individual fathers besides the ones we have here. And even if you look in the standard editions, some of the standard editions of the Rudder, they like in the canons, I think of Saint Timothy of Alexandria. They don't include this, oftentimes they don't include like the 19th. There's like a 19th canon of Saint Timothy of Alexandria, which some people have debated whether it should be included or not, although everybody kind of accepts it. For example, the Council, the Stoglov Council of 1557, or the Council of Moscow back in the 1660s. Another point would be that there was the councils held in Constantinople in the mid-1100s, early 1100s, that condemned various Eucharistic heresies. There was a council held either, I'm trying to go off memory, off the late 12th or then the mid-13th century by Patriarch Gregory II of Cyprus, which condemned the Filioque. Condemned the Filioque, the Synod of Blachernae. All right. They're all, 1285. Yeah. So, you have all these, and then the Palamite councils. Now, I don't know if any of these councils actually issued canons, like canonical decrees. And I think that may have been part of the issue with their inclusion in the Pedalion, was not that they were rejected, but did they actually issue canons? Because, for example, the 5th and the 6th ecumenical councils did not technically issue any canons that we have copies of. All right. And that's kind of the whole issue with Trullo. They kind of held it because they thought, well, they have to have canons added to the 6th council. So that's sometimes why I think Trullo was called the Quintisex Council, for example. Oftentimes it was meant to supply. Anyway. But the other point with St. Nicodemus was, remember, what made St. Nicodemus' writings so important was that he translated the canons from the older very high kind of quasi-classical Byzantine Greek,
Demotic Greek
into Demotic Greek, to a Greek that could be, that an average person could read and say, look, I understand this without having to, sit here and pull out a dictionary, to read. All right. And he wrote his commentaries in Demotic Greek. All right. So that was what made him so important. But there's unfortunately, as far as I know, there's not a part 2 to the rudder. Oftentimes people have asked about if it's possible to have a collection of all the other councils held. Now, there is supposedly, I have been told, and I've seen somewhere on the internet, something like a 7 or 8 volume set published by a printing house in Moscow that contains all councils of the Eastern Church, which includes more than the rudder. It contains something like 30 or 40 extra councils. And these are like local councils. You know what I mean by local? Like some council of Kiev, in 1400, which issued some local canons or something like that. Now it's all in Russian or in Slavonic, so I'm probably never going to, get a copy. I think I actually looked at it. It was like $1,000 to buy it anyway.
Wow.
So, but that's the truth. Most people don't order those books. If they only print 500 copies of a 10-volume set that has 500 pages each, that's, anyway. But you can find some other councils. For example, you can read St. Gregory the Great's writings to St. Augustine. He has canonical questions and answers about a number of issues. There's other stuff out there. You just got to know where to look. There are also a number of patriarchal decrees of the Ecumenical Patriarchate going back, 1,000 more years. For example, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1400? His name escapes me at the moment. But, there are various decrees he issued with even anathemas, though technically no one really... For example, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1400, Father Joseph?
I'd have to look that up. Give me 1 second.
He was the one that issued an anathema stating that anybody who celebrated the divine liturgy on a holy table that had consecrated relics, and he also used an antimens that had consecrated relics, was anathematized and deposed. And that was because the concept is that the antimens, I think he actually said you can't use an antimens on a consecrated table. No one really follows that anymore, that kind of stuff.
Matthew the First.
Yeah, Matthew. Okay, yes. So, for example, some of those patriarchal decrees, even that were kind of enunciated or proclaimed by the Indomusa Synod, which is kind of like his standing synod, they've never, oftentimes people will say, well, what about this decree of the ecumenical patriarchate in 1533, where he condemned, again, the decree of Patriarch Matthew in 1400, where he says that if you celebrate divine liturgy with an antimens on a holy table that already has consecrated relics in it, you should be condemned. But no one really does that,
One of the things that we have to remember also, Father, is that a lot of these things that were incorporated in council eventually became parts of other rules and other texts in the service.
Oh, no. Example, I know all I'm saying is that there are some, in fact, decrees that are kind of just faded away, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, but my point is that the things that survived within the living tradition of the church, like the anathemas and the Synodicon, so on and so forth, these are things that they're within the practice of the church, but they don't necessarily have they don't have the enduring value that the canons have, and it would be. I think it would be I think a text like that would be very interesting. I would think for canon lawyers, but in terms of the practical use, it would be for very, very, very obscure reasons. And so I'm not saying.
Can you rephrase that again, Father Joe? I'm sorry, I was looking at something. Can you kind of? I didn't catch all of that. Can you rephrase that?
What I was saying was that the things that were good in the local councils and the smaller councils that aren't as big as, say, the Palamite councils, is that often they would become incorporated into the tradition of the church. Mm-hmm. So the councils themselves, while they have value, like the ones that you were talking about in that book in Moscow, they would have a lot of value to maybe say canon lawyers for very specific purposes, but their practical value exists in the church still. Because it just became part of the rules we follow.
Yes, for example, I could go on. You're right. I shouldn't go on. Okay. Yeah. I'm the one of those persons that's interested in all that kind of stuff.
It's important to me. Yeah, no, it is. It is important, and it's good. I just don't want to. I don't want to give the impression that it's necessary while it's good. Because it's
I'm saying is that you can always pull out some decree of a patriarch from like 1422, and like saying again, there's a decree by Patriarch Matthew of Constantinople. It was written in an official letter to the Metropolitan Hierarchia, January of 1400, and he says the primitive purpose for which the Antimensians was instituted was to permit the celebration of the holy mysteries in places where there was no consecrated altar, in order to give communion to the moribund or to the newly baptized, or even out of devotion in favor of the emperor while in voyage. Exarchs or priests on a particular mission, bishops making the visitation of a vast diocese. However, when a fixed consecrated altar is to be found, it is bad taste and ostentatious, treating an altar as if it were interdicted or desecrated by placing antimensins on it before celebrating. If a bishop does this in the diocese of another, he should be treated as a usurper. If a priest who owns an antimensian uses it in this capricious manner, that is, putting it on a consecrated table, ostentatiously and with bad taste, he should be deposed and the antimensian dissequestered, even if it had been given to him by a metropolitan or patriarch. But if this priest owns the antimensian, because it is necessary, and if he uses it only where there is no consecrated fixed altar, or where such a one has lost its consecration, he should be allowed to keep it, provided that he uses it to celebrate in a decent place. All right? Now, my question is, are there cases nowadays in Orthodoxy in which somebody will use an antimensian even on a holy table that has consecrated relics in it? And if so, are those people now subject to deposition? Because you see what I'm trying to say? Hasn't that patriarchal ruling kind of gone into abeyance, so to speak?
Well, not necessarily. Actually, I can see a practical use purpose for it now. And again, even though neither of us is in World Orthodoxy, the whole Greek-Russian schism thing is a perfect example. I think what the Patriarch is talking about there, and correct me if I'm wrong, Father, is that a properly consecrated altar has relics in it. And what you're effectively saying, if you're, say, a guest of another, you come from another diocese, so on and so forth, and you say, no, I'm just going to use my antimensian over your altar. You get the implications that I'm getting at here, Father, that I don't think he was necessarily talking about like a priest using his own thing provided by the same bishop who consecrated the altar. It's talking more about visiting clergy who are trying to imply my relics are more than...
But if you read the first part of it, he's clearly stating that the purpose of an antimension is when the altar holy table has not been consecrated with relics. All right, that's what he's saying.
I think that there's a lot of unconsecrated holy tables out there that probably should.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, there's actually a decree, I believe, from the so-called infamous Council of Moscow back in the 1660s, which states that if a bishop, if you're celebrating at a church that has a consecrated holy table, you can still use an antimens, but the antimens shouldn't have relics on it. There's actually, I think that has to do with the fact that anyway. See, that's a minutia question, not to get too much involved in that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, technically, you could probably find, even harsher decrees. And does a decree issued by the Patriarch of Constantinople with, let's say, 20 or 30 bishops back in the 1400, does that have equal application to the Church of Antioch at the same time, or is that only really applying to the ecumenical patriarch and his sphere? So anyway. Yeah. Because obviously the ecumenical patriarch is not the Pope, is my point. He doesn't have universal jurisdiction with his decrees.
Now, God Save the Star wrote, can't really blame Ancient Faith Radio on their erroneous teaching of original sin. Outside of ROCOR, ancestral sin, quote unquote, is ubiquitous in North America. Guest Father Romanitas was quite influential. I think I don't know, even in
ROCOR, you have the Hockness stuff in ROCOR.
Yeah, I think that
you can't exonerate them.
I think it's really, I think the problem is that, it comes from the fact that in North America, especially in the past, because I don't think you'll find these things in writings or texts of 100 years ago. You find this as a product of the ecumenical age. And the problem is that when they're trying to unite Orthodoxy to Rome and these other churches, they tend to talk about differences without a distinction. So, ancestral sin makes us different. So we're going to call it ancestral sin because that sounds better and it's not original sin. And so on. It's a really ignorant, horrible. Yeah, it's gimmicky. That's exactly what it is. And the point is, too many people have fallen for the gimmick. And what we do is we work in apologetics. And the simple reality is you have to give a ready answer, a real answer. And the fact is, those aren't real answers. People have been fed this gruel of makeshift, quasi, ethnic, non-Orthodox Episcopalian type religion and packaged as orthodoxy. And then, when you actually have to defend the faith, you realize it doesn't quite sound that way. And so you have to get past that. And it's, it's not, I'm not trying to be offensive to anyone who innocently believes that the ancestral sin teaching is that distinct from original sin, because certainly there's no shortage of books and pamphlets and ancient faith radios that will say that it is, but it isn't. And
the simple answer is simply read canons 120 through 127 of the 419 Council of Carthage. It contains the dogmatic declaration of the church on what we believe about original sin. And what should happen is when as soon as you begin to print those canons and you go through with St. Nicodemus's commentary, even if you just put the canons themselves without St. Nicodemus' commentary, you will see a divide among people, and they will get really nervous reading those canons.
Yep.
All right. Anyway.
So then,
so Assaulterifer says probably includes the council that made the old believer sign of the cross the only way in Russia. To Nikon overturned it. That's talking about the Stoglov Council, which was 1550s, where Metropolitan Saint Macarius basically said, if you don't make the sign of the cross with 2 fingers outstretched and 3 fingers together, you're anathematized, which was overturned essentially by the councils in the 1660s. Now it's interesting, as far as I know, now I'm very kind of vague on this issue. Was the Russian church in the 1550s technically in communion with the ecumenical patriarchate?
Yeah, no, they were.
Okay, so it was a situation where the ecumenical patriarch, but ecumenical patriarch didn't recognize him as autocephalous, though, right?
I don't know. That was, I believe, that was a little bit.
I'm always confused about what happened, because I know on Mount Athos, when the Stoglov decrees were published, the Russian monks on Mount Athos were very upset because they said, this is ridiculous. We have to anathematize the Greek monks living right beside us now, essentially, and they refused to obey any of the decrees or receive them, really.
Well, Assault Rifle goes into some questions right afterwards, which I think tie right into it.
Okay, so he says, when Rocor made the Old Believers members of the church, that would be basically in the 70s, before Rocor joined the MP, would this mean the Old Believer priests are legit, and why doesn't the Russian church just up the Old Rite? Well, one, I think it should be pointed out that technically the Old Rite, the pre-Niconian Rite, was essentially rehabilitated in the mid to late 1700s. There was one Russian bishop who began to allow Old Believers to use their rites, the traditional rites, back in the 1750s. And then in the 1780s and 90s, the Holy Synod basically said, well, you can use, the Old Believers can come into the church and they can use their traditional rites. Although the Russian bishops were like, well, eventually we're going to make them give them up. But what happened is, by the end of the 19th century, they kind of began to allow the Old Rite to exist as a thing in itself in the Russian church, as being part of the Russian church. So Rocor did not, it wasn't Rocor that rehabilitated it. It happened in the late 18th and then the 19th century. Also, I think you had a number of the Slavophile historians in the mid-19th century that actually began to do a lot of manuscript studies. Mm-hmm. And they began to do some manuscript studies of Greek texts too. And they kind of found out that the basis for the 1660 decrees, that is the basis being that the Russian church had invented a lot of its customs, and it had just corrupted the text, that it wasn't really true. The problem was, within the political situation in the Russian Empire, you couldn't quite come out and say that, because people were afraid it would somehow delegitimize the Russian church or the empire. Now, I don't think it would have, but that's just the way people like, for example, Pavel Venatsky, I cannot pronounce his name. He was like the governor of the Holy Synod for a time. Anyway, they kind of thought like that. Rocor did that with one Old Believer church, by the way, in the 70s. They're referring to like a decree Rocor gave in like 1971 or 73, where they basically said, we don't recognize anathemas against the Old Rite. But then again, the Russian church back in the 19th century had effectively done the same by allowing what was called the edunaviri. And edunaviri means in Russian like co-religionist or something like that. Yeah. People of the same religion.
Of one belief.
Now, why doesn't the Russian church readopt the Old Rite? Well, to be honest, if you've been using the so-called Niconian Rite for 350 years, and that's become part, and it's got saints to its name, all right, it would be just as cruel, I think, to force everybody to give up what they've been using for 350 years as part of the Orthodox Church, as it was to cause all the problems in Russia in the 1660s to begin with. If you see my point, Father Joseph.
No, I agree.
So there's no real reason to force all this issue, and it's really an interior Russian question. And he says, "I'm not." Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
He says, "I'm not an Old Believer, but I do sympathize for their cause, and I think the Old Rite is very traditional, pious, and the original practice of the Russian and shouldn't be thrown away." Well, that's true, but I think also you have to believe that have to understand like a lot of the things the Old Believers do are crazy. I mean, the Old Rite isn't crazy, but a lot of the Old Believers are kind of heretical.
Yeah, and one thing that we should remember is that we're kind of, a lot of Old Believer discussion in America is
it's idealized.
It's idealized. It's out of a book. I mean, in Russia, and this is just my experience, Old Believer practices are kind of admired as like the original way. But the thing is, a lot of people know that and they glorify that and mention it, but they don't do them. And then a lot of people who do them are very contemporary people. I mean, there's bloggers in Russia who are, Old Believers that, they follow the Old Rite, so on and so forth. I don't know that that's, I think that it's, again, it's like, not to minimize this, but it's kind of almost like, looking at the Old West and the days of the cowboys and thinking I'm going to move to Texas or something. It's not as meaningful as I think people make it out to be, at least in the current day in Russia. I think that there are many Old Rite people who obviously very strongly believe what they believe, and they consider, the New Right people to be heretics. But when it comes right down to it, they're fighting over, how to do the sign of the cross, both of which are ancient forms of doing the sign of the cross.
But remember, the old believers, if they're old believers as opposed to old ritualists, and old ritualists would be people I consider that would be part of, I would say, a real Orthodox church and use the old rite. Okay. But old believers will say stuff like, for example, I was reading something I don't know, like a few weeks ago about an article translated from Russian by kind of one of the chief secretaries for public relations or something like that of the Old Believer Church that has this Metropolitan Cornelia in Moscow.
Oh yeah, okay.
And he frankly states that he says something like, to even talk about there being a ritual in Orthodoxy is heresy, because there is no such thing as one ritual or another ritual. It is Orthodoxy, and what he means by that is to say that you can have multiple different rites in Orthodoxy of self-contained liturgical practices. Their view is that's heresy. So the old believer,
that's the same view of Patriarch Nikon.
Yeah, exactly. So the old believers would say that the old believers, you got to remember, the old believers weren't arguing that just let us use our stuff, and they were saying the real strict old believers were saying that if you make the sign of the cross with 3 fingers, you have apostatized and you are a heretic.
Yeah,
we're not going to allow anything. All right. I mean, and also let's again, don't, like he says, don't romanticize. There were things going on in pre-Niconian Russia that were, in fact, crazy. Let me give you an example. If you read, it was translated in the late 19th century, the kind of the diary or the responses of the humble Nikon. Okay, it's basically Patriarch Nikon's defense against, because basically after Patriarch Nikon changed over to the new rite, even though a lot of the bishops went along with it, they still hated him. And so did a lot of the Greek patriarchs for some reason. And they eventually deposed Patriarch Nikon, by the way, is an interesting story. But anyway, if you read these responses, you find that when a Russian bishop back in, let's say in 1600 was translated from one diocese to another, they reconsecrated it. All right. And when they were deposing Patriarch Nikon, the Greek Orthodox representatives of the Constantinople were like, we've never heard of this. This is crazy. You allow this to happen? You should be deposed, because technically there's a canon that says if you reordain somebody who's already ordained, you should be deposed. All right, both the person who allowed it to happen and the one who did it. And Patriarch Nikon's like, well, look, everybody was doing this. I didn't know it was that bad, because apparently the Komchaya Kaninga, that their version, how they were interpreting that apostolic canon, it was somehow being reinterpreted, because I guess, I don't know, there was some misplacement of a verb or something. I don't know. You have to read it. But Patriarch Nikon was like, well, we thought that only applied if you were being consecrated to the specific see a second time, but not to a second see or something like that. So the idea that everything that happened, in pre-Niconian Russia was wonderful and great, there were abuses that had to be corrected. Like reordaining bishops when they get for example, when they get moved from this see to become the Patriarch of Moscow, you don't do a reconsecration of the bishop. You may have to maybe reinstall him, which is like not the same as reading all the prayers of ordination over on him again.
Right, you're not reading
exactly. Now I don't think to be honest, if you were to be very strict, you would say technically all those Russian bishops were liable to deposition and greatly sinned, and they committed deadly sin, and God would have condemned them. But I'm more lenient in saying that they probably were simply ignorant. They didn't really understand, even if they were educated. They just thought, well, technically, because their thinking was that they rightly understood a bishop, when he's consecrated to a see, according to the strict meaning of the canons, he has to be there forever.
Yeah, right? He dies there.
Exactly that. Like, I think a second ecumenical council state that forbids the translations of bishops unless there's
and so that part makes sense. But
so what happened is they reasoned but they wrongly reasoned from that if he's translated to another see, he has to be consecrated for that see. All right,
because he's lost his episcopate.
Exactly. So because they thought his episcopate was tied indelibly to that one place in some sort of I don't know, metaphysical, mystical sense. And so they thought, well, for him to be the bishop of another place, he has to be given another consecration. All right. Now that I see what they're trying to say there, but it just doesn't make sense. And Matthew Blasteris, the Byzantine canonical commentator, and others, they and the Greeks at the Moscow Synod in the 1660s that tried Nikon, they were correct in criticizing the Russians for doing this stuff. All right. So my only point is saying that not everything that was happening, in pre-Nikonian Russia was, wonderful and great. There were real problems. It doesn't mean the reaction was correct either.
Well, no, the assault rifle said the original believers were like Matthewites then.
That's like an insult to the Matthewites, I think.
Yeah, I would say that's kind of insulting to the Matthewites. The Matthewites, for all their problems, and for the difficulties that they've had with the Florinites, etc., they didn't really change any beliefs, or there weren't Matthewite sects that were worshiping through a hole in the wall or anything ridiculous like that. It's a little unfair to the Matthewites because all the old calendarists in Greece were under extremely difficult circumstances, especially in the early days of the Old Calendar Church of Greece, when they were putting bishops in prison, so on and so forth. To be
honest, the same thing was done to the old believers too.
Well, to some of them, and the richer ones, no, that wasn't the case. I mean, because remember that many of the old believers were in the merchant class and in areas where they were prominent, and they did not get the treatment the Matthewites.
I think also people should investigate the connection between the funding of the old believers and the early Bolsheviks. That's something that people need to look at too. That a number of the old believer merchants actually gave money to Lenin and to some of the other Bolsheviks. And that's something that's kind of not really talked about, because a lot of them so much hated the Romanov family. They didn't even believe they were the real Romanovs, by the way, that they were willing to cheer on the destruction of the Tsarist government because they felt, oh, well, these are our enemies. All right.
Yeah.
So now that backfired. That kind of backfired on them eventually, but
well, they did. They were recognized by the Soviets.
Oh yeah, exactly. Here's the other point: why, if the old believers were these, and I think we've talked about this before, if they're the purest of the pure, why were the old believers allowed to publicly operate as a church from the mid 1940s until 1992, 91 in the Soviet Union? Nobody could publicly operate unless they were controlled by the Soviet government. So somehow that right there invalidates the old believer claim to begin with. But that shows you the true nature of the old believer heresy. It's the heresy of that. It's the heresy of form, of simply the ritual is what conveys everything. That as long as they allow, that's like why you have these old believers in the 1920s that joined the Roman Catholics as the Russian Greek Catholic old rite.
Yeah,
exactly. Because as long as somebody allowed them to use the old rite, that's all they cared about. And that was in fact why Saint Paisius Velichovsky, was so irritated at the old believers that if they joined him, he said, "No, you have to make this. I think he was almost in principle. He acknowledged you could make the sign of the cross with two fingers, but he was so agitated about how the old believers acted and what they were hiding under their views that they just wanted priests from him or him to get priests for him, and that was all they cared about.
Yeah.
All right. So they were willing to lie and deceive people in order to do that.
Now, this is, Assault Rifle said, sorry, I don't mean offense to the Matthewites. I just mean the same kind of strictness with the priesthood and episcopate. As somebody Father Enoch, we've both been in true Orthodoxy a pretty long time. I mean, I converted in true Orthodoxy, as did you. So we're talking a couple of decades here. Strictness is a funny thing. And what I mean by that is that people can get very selective with Acravia. They can kind of say, well, we're holding the strict position, and then suddenly it softens up when you need it to. And this is true in virtually every true Orthodox synod at one point or another. It's not a bad thing. The bad thing isn't using economy. The bad thing is pretending you don't. And so the problem is, I don't see the Matthewites as being more or less strict. I see them as just being more or less selective. And that's not just true with Matthewites. It's true with Florinites. It's true with a lot of people. And that's something that we have to...
I think it should... And one of the things that has to be pointed out, that the only reason for a break in communion is over heresy condemned by the fathers or the councils.
Yep.
If people keep on bringing up this issue about, well, we can't be in communion with somebody because they're those bishops are morally corrupt. Frankly, that's not a reason for breaking communion, just moral corruption. All right. Or because a bishop, let's say, makes his 19-year-old nephew a priest. That's not a reason for breaking communion. That's wrong. All right. But that's not a reason for breaking communion. All right. The only reason for breaking communion is the dogmatic reason. All right. So the reason I bring that up is people talk about, well, we had to break communion to save the canon, because people were violating the canons. Well, frankly, if the canons they were violating were not dogmatic canons, there is no reason for breaking communion. You may not like it, and you need to try to find ways to discipline people or to bring bishops to account. But if you go back into Greece in the 18th century and the 19th century, there was simony rampant. All right, and St. Nicodemus talks about this in the Rudder, where there were people claiming that there was no one really ordained in Greece because they said technically if you're ordained simoniacally, you should be deposed, and then they reasoned that the deposition happens ipso facto. And St. Nicodemus says no, depositions do not happen ipso facto. They have to be enforced by council. It's only for dogmatic reasons that you can separate and all the rest. I hate to bring it up, but everybody makes that same mistake, and that's
I agree.
Okay.
Now, Catholic traditionalist writes, "Hi, Deacon. I'll be debating Metzlick this Thursday on the topic of baptism." Well, I'm assuming we're going to close out the broadcast pretty soon, but I'll say this. I'm not done talking with, Matt and Andrew. I find that they have legitimate questions. One thing that I think that a notion I wanted to disabuse them of was that Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism are slightly different versions of the same thing. I think to some degree I did that, and God willing, there will be some good positive purpose to it. I was planning to call in this Thursday, but mostly for the second half. If you're debating, I don't know who you are, but if you're debating on the topic of baptism, and I happen to be there, well, that's good for you. But if it's something that disagrees with the Orthodox tradition, I'm going to disagree with you too.
Well, I think Matt Slick and people like him, they do not believe in baptismal regeneration. To them, baptism is a kind of a bare symbol of entering some kind of covenant, and it doesn't convey baptismal grace. I
was a little bothered, and I mentioned this to Matt, and I'm not going to let him go on this, is that he started to come to this bizarre conclusion that based on his reading of the scriptures that our Lord was sprinkled. And that's just, no, I flat out told him that's just, no, that's not true. It's unacceptable. But he wants to believe it, and I think that's until he.
That's a common point. People from he's a Reformed, because he does believe in infant baptism. I've been reading some things, but he's part of the Reformed Protestant tradition.
Yeah, but believing Christ was baptized by sprinkling.
Well, I think that's part of their understanding, because what they're trying to make the assumption in the Reformed tradition and the Reformed Protestantism that somehow baptism is kind of like illustration, which is basically in the Old Testament where they would sprinkle holy water on people. And for example, that how they. Okay, do you know how it says St. Paul says that the Jews passed under the cloud?
Yeah.
When they went through the cloud of the water, basically when they went through the Red Sea. And so what a lot of Calvinists will argue is that, well, water was only sprinkling on them. They weren't being physically in the water, up to their heads and over their bodies and such. All right. But I think that misses the point that St. Paul is making kind of a typological metaphor. I'm not sure the word, that they're underneath the water of sorts, Well,
it just seems like they're countering tradition for the sake of countering tradition.
And baptism, and the word baptism itself means to what?
To immerse. Right. And then, it just, I just couldn't, I was a little dumbfounded by that, because I thought he had just gotten infected by just thinking everyone's okay to be sprinkled, in the Roman Catholics or something. It just struck me.
Even within Roman Catholicism, at least up into the 1940s, I don't know if it's true anymore. At least up to the 1940s, the Roman Catholic belief, if you read old Roman Catholic moral theology manuals, was that sprinkling was doubtful, but you should do it if somebody's dying. And they would, in fact, be given a conditional baptism if they survived a deathbed sprinkling by pouring. All right. Anyway,
that goes against St. Cyprian, though. I mean, that
Well, here's the problem. St. Cyprian uses the word profusa. All right. And the problem is the word profusa really means pouring. All right. So anyway, he used anyway. The point was the point is that if you look at the Didache, all right. Well, remember, I think what Saint Cyprian is talking about people who are being baptized on their deathbeds, though, to begin with, in that letter.
Yeah, he was talking. Well, he was talking about on a sick bed, but he says that if
that's the point.
The person, but he says that if the person is healed, you shouldn't redo it.
Yeah. But the point is, as far as I understand, it has to be interpreted. It has to be interpreted with what his word is actually saying with the Latin word, because it could be sprinkling, it could be pour.
Right, but sprinkler or pouring aside is not my point. My point is that certainly nobody would argue. Nobody would argue that Christ was baptized through sprinkling. That's.
Well, no, there are people who argue that.
Yeah, I realize that now. I'm blown away by it. I'm just like, that makes no sense. It's like, that's like the Jehovah's Witnesses when they try to say that stavru can mean steak. I mean, it's just like, you can't just make stuff up and.
Well, every now and again, people will bring up the image in Ravenna. If you go into what's called the Baptistry of the Orthodox, which is one of the ancient baptistries built by, I think.
Yeah, you had been talking about that, not on the show. But yeah.
So if you look at if you go to Ravenna, I've never been there, but if you go to Ravenna, if you go to the Baptistry of the Orthodox, and you look at the ceiling, the center of the dome in the baptistry, well, it looks like it has an ancient mosaic of St. John the Baptist having a patera or dish pouring water on the head of our Lord. And that has been used by a number of people to say, well, that proves they were doing pouring. That was the normal form of baptism back in the 500s. Well, the problem is, no, that's not the case. The mosaic was restored back in the 1890s by a German artisan who simply assumed that that's the proper way of baptism. All right, because the artist was like, well, why would the hand of St. John the Baptist be extended above Christ's hand? He must have been holding a patera to pour water in his head. Well, if you look in the other baptistries in Italy, they have the exact same position, but the hand of St. John the Baptist is on the head of Christ. All right, so when they restored the baptistry of the Orthodox in the 1890s, they unintentionally in the restoration of the mosaic, they distorted the image. So they put a patera in the hand of St. John the Baptist, where they should have just had St. John's hand on our Lord's head, ready to immerse him in the water. All right? So, anyway.
Well, apparently, I don't know who this guy is. He says, close one-on-one debate the Met. It's an open radio broadcast. I'm not against. I was just going to call in at 9. I figured, call in after I'm done here.
Well, he's bringing up the point that, again, most of the modern-day Calvinists and Methodists do not believe baptism is necessary for salvation, because they don't connect John. Their view is that, when our Lord says you must be born of water and the Spirit, they don't view that water as referring to baptism.
The water of birth. And
exactly. It's like the amniotic fluid or something like that.
Yeah, it's silly. And I think that's something that I brought that up, and he said, okay, so you believe in water baptism? I said, yeah. And he just said, okay, and moved on. And I was like, I didn't realize that was a big deal to him. I thought that I thought he simply agreed with me.
No, they don't believe in that. And St. Paul talks about washing with water in the Word. When St. Ananias, what's given in the book of Acts between St. Paul and St. Ananias says, "Rise up and be baptized and wash away thy sins." All right, St. Peter says, "Baptism doth now save us."
Well, if you think of St. Philip and the Ethiopian, what's the point of him avoiding being baptized? Why would he rush to baptism if it wasn't necessary?
Exactly.
I'm just dumbfounded.
Yeah, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved.
Yeah, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. But again.
Well, what happens, I think, is they say, well, faith alone saves, grace alone, faith alone saves. Therefore, what they reason is baptism is a work. Therefore, if you're being baptized, that's not faith.
Well, I have a question.
That's how they reason.
This fellow came on, and he obviously is interacting with us here. I'd love it if you came on here and wanted to talk to us, say about like Hildebrand or something. Maybe talk about the structure of the church and what you believe on it, because we're not just trying to save Matt Slick. We're trying to save it's the Holy Spirit who saves, but we're the unworthy vessels that are doing the talking right now. So. We'd love to discuss, what you believe on the structure of the church and why you're not part of it.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Orthodox equals Asian Catholicism. Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't, Francisco. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Asian,
sure. Why not?
Asian. How does that even work?
Well,
Korea.
it's like that
Well,
meme with the anime and the Bishop of Japan. I thought that was hilarious. But
when I think Asian, I think Korea and Japan. I guess maybe I should really Asian. I guess I should really be thinking of a modern of Asia Minor, right? Right.
yeah, sure. Yeah, we can produce a link. That's not a problem. Just contact us either through either of us through either YouTube or Facebook. And
When's the next time we're going to do a program?
I guess I'm still going to work on this tomorrow. I have a feeling I'm going to have more problems with the computer, so I guess we'll probably do Thursday.
Wait, are you going to be calling this program of Matt Slick on Thursday?
Well, that's at 9. I'm just going to call it 9. I don't want to take up this whole show arguing all over again. I mean, I want it to be much faster and not take up it shouldn't be the Deacon Joseph show. That's this one. No, just kidding, Father.
I don't care. But
in any case, yeah, no, because we'd love that. We could use smart apologetical people to convert to Orthodoxy, and that's our goal. So if you're up for it, they're a Catholic traditionalist. Do you have a name? We like names.
All right, I think that's enough for tonight. Let's close things down.
All right. Well, in that case, so yeah, I guess we'll go for Thursday at 8:00. Then is what we're doing, Father.
Yep. Okay.
All right. Benedicite.
Benedicite. Benedicite.